first waterbirth. The political jewel for a midwife was the call to attend a home birth. The now romanticised and popularised home birth in the early 1990s was a confirmation of the potential reclamation of woman-centred birthing power, as well as a battle cry for midwives to be in touch with the spiritual lineage of their forebears. Of course, with the feminist tussle for birthing rights of upper to upper middle class women struggling to assert themselves, and the absolutely fabulous fashion statement of a home birth, this was altogether reinforced and was exciting as a result to the midwives taking the cause. This was something I was not immune to, and my almost vitriolic support of women's rights to choose their birthing environment was further assisting me in my acceptance of somehow supporting women in their emancipation from patriarchal control. A grandiose statement that felt altogether true. That aside, the birth I was called to on this occasion involved a pool, was a home birth, and had nothing to do with the movement of furthering the cause. It was purer than that. It was a simple convenience, a practical solution, for a mother of 7 children to simply have another child. To have a child the way that she had had her others. It was a true end goal. It was something familiar to the celebrated midwives of old that were simply attending women in their home, because that is what they did. The call to attend this home birth was not a call from a political antagonist, not a call from a greatly educated or well-to-do woman exercising her cosmopolitan rights. This was a call from a woman from a housing estate with a dubious reputation on the outskirts of town. The call was actually made from one of the woman's teenage daughters, a call that continued the reinforcement of the normality of the event. Mum's having another baby, and asked me to call you. As was typical at this time, team midwives in their group of 4 had a primary and a secondary midwife on call. The primary midwife would attend admissions to hospital, any phone query or concerns, and any visitation to the person's home, and this included the first to respond and go to the home of the labouring home birther. The second midwife as a generalised backup to the first at busy times, and in the instance of home births, to be present for the birth itself. A supervisor of midwives was also allocated proportionately to all practicing midwives. This supervisor assisted in ensuring that all women acknowledged the provision of accurate information on which they based their decisions in relation to their care. On this occasion, Margaret, the pregnant woman in question, would have been made aware of the statistical chances of postpartum hemorrhage, complications that could be compounded as a result of birthing at home, etc., and made her supported choice. All women having a home birth were also encouraged to meet all the midwives in the team planning the home birth prior to the event, to encourage familiarity of persons as well as geographical location and any other compounding aspect, parking, dogs, other children and property access, etc. This had been the case in this instance, but I had only met her once previously, when I had addressed not meeting her in the course of her antenatal care by answering her need for equipment to be dropped at the residence on her 36-week check. The equipment comprising of resuscitation, Inco pads, birthing packs, and script to be filled for 3rd stage management medication. This 36-week component of care was utilised as a catch-up with me and any other unmet members of our team. GPT mornings and community events usually ensured all women had several opportunities to meet the midwives, but often not with grand multiparous women, childcare and home duties being the restrictive factor there. The call came in the form of a page to my pager from the hospital. Mobile phones were relatively new, and we were issued with them for attending a home birth. But women were encouraged to phone the hospital's birthing ward, and they would in turn page us with the quoted text. Call the hospital or woman directly, and then either go straight to her or call as needed. The teenager who had made the call's nonchalance was not an informative indicator as to the urgency or indication of progress that a mum was experiencing, whether signs of early labour or the proverbial "will someone pick that up" from Monty Python's Meaning of Life. The fact that this was the woman's 8th child dictated an immediate response of urgently getting to her home, to either assess, evaluate, or indeed assist with the birth. The trip was adrenaline-fueled, with blinkered singular focus and an imaginary blue light and sirens blazing to cut through traffic. Of course, there was no blue light, no caterwauling of urgent intent as my combi negotiated the traffic to the address, but arrival was nonetheless appropriate. There was no hindrance of congestion because of the very reasonable hour of 6 p.m. The autumnal twilight and coldness of the air gave a calming quiet upon the scene as the knocker struck the red timber door of the semi-detached house. There were toys in the garden, strewn from youthful ambitious play, semi-submerged in the 2 patches of overgrown lawn that framed the centre path to the door. The windows of the house emitting a golden warmth of occupation. The door was answered by one of the teenage children, an extremely time-sensitively fashioned and overtly made-up and heavily jewelled-adorned child of the 90s, without question. She was tall, and in my remembering eye was chewing gum, and waved me to the foot of the stairs with a hand gesture and the words, "She's up there." I caused her little more than a half double-take as she acknowledged my gender with raised eyebrow. I walked up the walled staircase with my birthing pack beating the rhythm of my ascending strides. On entering the landing, it became clear that all the doors but one were open, and I became aware of the non-occupation of these rooms, raising the deduction that the closed door had the petitioning purpose. The hum and stirs of a busy, fruitful family were a familiar soundtrack of a grand multiparous household, and the protection of that microcosm by the matriarch at potential times of her stress was also not that unusual. I knocked on the concealing bedroom door and awaited my answer with a customary deep exhalation that heralded a purposeful deep breath of focus and calm. "Come in" encouraged a moment of anticipated discovery, a moment of sudden exposure akin to Dorothy's colourful transformation from the monochromatic fallen house in the Land of Oz. As the door opened, I saw Margaret was lying sacrificial to her endeavours on a large centralised king-size bed. There was another teenager on the far side of the room busying herself with the attentive tasks, and a man, who I presume was the partner, standing up against the wall of the head of the bed smoking a cigarette. He glanced at me, and with a nod communicated his seasoned experience of this event. The girl acknowledged me with a smile and a frozen pause of activity, before continuing in her endeavours. Margaret herself returned from a fixed, concentrated abdominal gaze to a sweeping glance with the words, "I'll need you to check me, feels like I'm ready." Her hierarchical status dictated little inquiry on my part, no challenge to her passive position, no commentary as to the benefits, intentions and purpose or risk of the requested intervention. Instead, a simple of course. She was in her rightful status of being in charge. Her acceptance of my care is assumed and not sought. By her active direction, she freed me from the usual sensitivities of ensuring my accepted status as her midwife. I placed the bag to one side and took out all the necessary things I would require for the examination, as well as the things I may need for a quick birthing scenario. I cleared an area of the long dark wood dresser in preparation, and unfolded the sterile birthing pack, and prepared it by adding the clamps, the scissors, pads, cleaning solution, 2 pairs of sterile gloves, etc. For the exam, I used the outside packaging of my gloves as a familiar makeshift field, where I squeezed out some lubricating gel. As I was preparing, Margaret regained her fixed abdominal gaze and her breathing changed, heralding another contraction. The expediency of preparation for birth arrested my thoughts of assessing its strength, but I quickly palpated and listened to the fetal heart upon signs of its conclusion. My back ached as I stretched and pivoted across the bed's expanse to accomplish this. It wasn't said, but as is often the case, there was a tangible degree of resentment and frustration at these preparations that were hindering the action. The reassuring beat of the soon-to-be-greeted baby's heart going a long way for ensuring these frustrations remained unspoken and existed as only fleeting facial expressions. The preparations of resuscitation equipment having already been attended at home before departure meant I was ready to do what was requested. "You have to do it from the bed, I'm not moving," she said. After encountering the back-wrenching discomfort of the simple palpation, I agreed. "I've had all my babies like this, and I think I'm close," she said. Clambering onto the bed with my makeshift sterile field clasped like a purse, I positioned myself just off-centre between her legs and put on the gloves. The mattress pocketed me and sagged around my knees, which meant a constant weight shift to maintain balance. I glanced at Dad, looking at me expectantly, as I said, "Okay, Margaret, I'm just going to examine you now. I'm just going to..." But changed focus as Margaret ushered me on to come on, get on with it. The Dad camaraderily gave me a smile as he changed his glance back to his wife. As my fingers began the examination and the assessment criteria came to mind, vagina warm and moist, posterior wall, presenting part, Margaret called out, "It's too late. Here's another one." Her tone was different, the urgency evident, and the pressure against my examining fingers was without ambiguity. She was pushing, and the head was now coming, shielded by a high-tension bag of water. My fingers remained, as is usual in this instance, still, so as not to contribute to any discomfort, but still enough to enable a continuance after the contraction had ended. The force built until I was aware of a release and a corresponding warmth and wetness at my lower thighs and knees. Her water had broken, and the head had already caught up. The contraction began to ease, but the head was making itself known to my digits. The depth of her waters were shown by the indications of the rising band of warm wetness filling the man-made mattress Liquor Lake. I was acutely aware of the situation as my bottom felt the first touch of wetness beneath it, but there was no time to address this, as Margaret, with little passing of time or respite, bore down again. This time my fingers were being pushed out, and I recalled them serve as guides for the head as it followed through and emerged from her openness. The head birthed quickly, as was expected, with little or no demarcation of shoulders, and my hands guided the baby to her approaching hands and delivered the baby onto her chest. In a composure only expressed by a woman that has birthed many children, she greeted her baby with, "There you are." The clamber off the bed was ungainly, and was met with crumpled faces of amusement at my uncomfortability, at my now cooling dampness. The baby was quiet, as was already sucking on a full but rolled out breast. Expert maternal hands had squished and stuffed into the open mouth in a way never found in a modern-day lactation expert syntax. The family enveloped and closed around Margaret, and the space I left was occupied by this protective henge of togetherness. This family protection parted again as Margaret called the afterbirth is coming. It came into the quickly placed kidney dish. A small trickle of claret, then a sigh of relief. Her fundus was a solid, firm sphere cupped in my hand. It confirmed the signature of natural proficiency. The drawn-up oxytocic would remain in case, but its intended prophylactic usage was muted. Intact and no evidence of bleeding confirmed, I withdrew again, and the family's encircling embrace. Downstairs the doorbell rang, and I correctly surmised it was the second midwife's arrival. As I greeted Mia at the door, she smiled knowingly and said, "Tea?" Its quaint English understatement perfect for what had just occurred. I smiled, nodded, and signalled I was going to back upstairs to observe and remain available. Mia would eventually bring up a plate of marmalade on toast and an adequate teapot with assortment of mugs, milk and sugar on a serving tray. The approved greetings and reintroductions of Mia heralded a change in my role. I retired downstairs to document the arrival and experience, whilst fresh, if not contemporaneous. And Mia would observe, and if needed assist with cleaning and comfort measures. Mia was more familiar with Margaret, and was included in the protectoral partition of people, as it should be. The congratulations, hugs and tears only muted by me closing the door as I left the room. The whole episode for me would have been less than 3 hours, but had an emotional permanence, and remains with me today. After all, it was the first birth I attended in a body of water. Margaret would have seen several days following the birth, and a longer period of time when she was still on the books, for quick access to assistance as she needed. She would have eventually seen our visits as being an intrusion and superfluous to her needs as she returned to her normalised life, and this in itself reflected the magic and beauty which midwives are so privileged to share and experience. As she chatted, hugged and cried with Mia in her birthing room, a softness and unchecked emotion was exposed and shared, a rare glimpse into the Margaret that lies behind her purposeful exterior, an accomplished, loving mother whose vulnerabilities, seldom revealed, enriched our lives and enveloped her family.